So last time we returned values from all of our functions. Um, it turns out that you don't actually have to do that, but it's really important that you know what's going to happen if you do or don't. So let's just create a function here. And for simplicity, I'm just going to call it func. And then in here, let's say that I print to a file. So I call another function or whatever that's called print to file. And then that's it. Let's say that's all I do. Well, if I were to call this function and I'm expecting something back, so I'm expecting some result, then, and I'm just for so that I can run it, and I'm just going to have that pass. So print to file is not going to do anything, and then func is not going to return anything. So if I try to run this, and then let's print out the result, then when I run it, I get the value none. So basically, so return the value none. And so that's what happens in Python when you don't return something, when you don't actually specify return, a value. It actually puts a return statement in there for you. It puts this one in, return none. And so that's what's going to happen whenever you leave out return a return statement. So you got to be careful with that. So what if we were expecting a true or false coming back from function or func? And then I wanted to do like an if statement. If result. Well, it's never going to come in here because none resolves to false. So if I put if result, it's going to be false every time, and it's never going to come in here. Or what if I'm expecting a number to come back, like how many lines it printed to the file? Then let's say that I wanted to say, oh, well, last time when I printed a file, I printed 3, and then I also want to add that with the result. Well, what's going to happen? Oh, well, look, turns out you can't add int and none type. So same thing goes if I were going to try to concatenate a string with the result of func. So you just have to be careful that when you're dealing with none, the none type, you just can't really do anything with it. So it can be useful. A none can mean that, hey, something didn't work or nothing was expected. And, if we know that that's going to be what's coming back, then if we know, so a function that does not return anything is called a void function. So if I know that func is a void function, then I can just call it and not care that it's not going to return anything. So that's always an option as well. So none is something that you need to be aware of. It shows up all the time and you're going to have to handle it. So you might have to do things like, in the example we had before with result, you might have to say if result equals none, then do something like that. So you might have to handle none. So it's important that you know what it is. Also, moving on to a different thing, we're going to be talking about keyword arguments. So functions, if I were to create a function called minus, and then it took a first and a second, and then it would return first minus second. So that's basically just what this minus operator does, but I'm making a function to do it. So if I want to call minus with 4 and 1, then the answer, let's print it out, 3. But what if I do this? I want to make the second go first, and then the first go second. That's -3. So what this is keyword arguments. So if you know what a function calls its parameters right here, you can explicitly use them right here. We could also say, I'm just going to always have the second be 1. Let's say that, whatever this one could be, so we could call it decrement. And so you could just give it 2 values, and then the second one will always be 1 unless you specify it. So in this case, if I call decrement with 5, then I should get a 4. But if I do 5 and 1, or sorry, 2, I should get a 3. But this also means, so this first argument is what's called a positional argument. It means that it has to be in this position. It can't be in any other order. And if I don't specify any keyword arguments, then they have to go in the order that it puts here. But I could do, as soon as I start using keyword arguments, then I could start doing this. I'm going to also have to do that as well. So since that's a positional argument, I have to specify the keywords. If I don't, then it's saying, oh, I don't know what that non-keyword argument after the keyword argument is. So it's important that you do that. But this can be kind of handy because it means that you can change the order that you give parameters to functions. Maybe it just reads a little bit better. It also means that if you had a function that had a lot of things in it, so let's say that we had an add function, and in this add function we actually had 3 numbers, and the third one is optional and it's just going to be 0. And then we could do, our just our standard 1 1 1, and that should be 3. But if we just wanted to leave that off, it would be 2. So both are valid. Even though we didn't pass in that value, because we had this equals 0, it's going to give us the default of 0. So that's kind of useful. It also means that we could change the order of these. So keyword arguments can be really handy. There's something that you will see is if you're using other people's modules, sometimes they have you use keyword arguments. So those can be really handy. So the next thing we're going to talk about is scope. And so we're just hitting on a bunch of topics here related to functions. And so scope is something that's really interesting. So let's say that I've got a number variable and it's going to be 42 because that's the answer. And then we've got a function here that wants to, when we call this function, it returns the answer. Okay, so this is a valid program because, so if I call func, it's going to just return 42. And that's because func can see the number 42. It's defined in a scope that func can see. But let's say in here, func defines a variable 24. And then it just, prints it out. So it's going to print out val, and then it's going to return still num. So now when we call func, it's going to get num, or let's do result equals func. But then if I tried to print val, what do you think is going to happen? So val is 24. It's going to print out val here, so we're going to see 24 come out here for sure. We know that. Then we're going to return num, and num is defined right here, so func can see it. Then it's going to return num. Actually, let's have it return val. Yeah. So let's have it return val. Then we can print result, and then we just want to print val. And it's going to throw up. It's going to say, whoa, val is not defined. And so right here, it doesn't know about val. Even though it defined it in this scope, it doesn't know about it. And the reason why is because things that are defined in a function get their own scope. It's called a local scope. And once you've got one of these local scopes, as soon as you exit that function, that scope is torn down. It no longer exists. So if you want to return the value that was defined in a function, you must return it. Sorry, if you want to see the value after the function goes away, you must return that value. So it's really important that we do that. So just like we did here, we printed the result, we returned val. So let's say we wanted to return num and 42. Well, just do that. So in this case, we could define val in this scope. So we're going to say val was something up here, and it's also going to be defined down here. So we're defining it in both places. So scope could have, it could have its own lesson. It's really a vast topic. There's a lot to talk about in terms of scope. but these are the basics. So you just need to know that this is a global scope, and things that are like functions can see things that are in the global scope, but the global scope cannot see what is in a local scope. And I can say global, or I can also say parent. So let's say that I had a function that's called main, and it calls func. Well, main down here, our main function, can see the global scope num42, but it cannot see its child scope that's func. So when main calls func, func is now a child of main, and it still cannot see. Parents cannot see into their children's scopes. So that's really important to know that. So, and there's even more to talk about with scope, and I'm not gonna go into it. There are things called closures that if you're really interested in this and you really want to learn more about it, you can go look that up on your own time. But it's important to know on the basics how scope works. The last thing that I'm going to talk about is there's going to be a little bit of a bonus round today, but the last thing we're going to talk about is higher order functions. And this is more of an advanced topic, but I think it's important to know because in Python it's really useful and it's used all over the place. So even though it's kind of advanced, I still think it's critical for learning Python. So let's say that I've got a function called operate. And what it's going to do is it's going to basically just call a function that it's given with an operator, and it's going to call it with the first argument and the second argument. And that's really all it does. So I'm going to call operate with the first and the second argument. And so, not operate, it's going to be operator here. So this one is going to be a function. And you might be thinking, usually all we've done is given arguments, given numbers or strings or booleans to functions. But there's no reason why you can't give a function to another function. And so down here we could have the add function like we had earlier, and it's just going to take a first and a second, and then it's going to return the first plus the second. Then if we call operate on using the add function and then 1 and 2, and let's print out the result, and we're going to want to return here as well. Well, that printed out 3. That's perfect. So when we add 1 and 2, we get 3. So, and this is kind of just a simple, silly example, but I hope you can see that it can be really, really useful to give a function to another function. Because let's say that we had, many different kinds of add or minus or divide or multiply or whatever, then we can just have one function that knows how to call all of those. And that might be really useful to you. So this is something that it's not really complicated when you really think about it. This function just takes another function and then calls it using something else. We could say that when we call this, so maybe add takes a first and a second, but operate only gives it a first, and so the second is always going to be 1. Maybe that's the example. So if we call operate with 1 and 1, then we still get a valid answer. So does that make sense? So we were able to call this add function even though we didn't have 2 numbers to give it. We only had 1 number to give it down here. So anyway, these are silly examples, but it's really important that you know what higher order functions are. So this operate function is called the higher order function because it accepts other functions. Okay, so moving on to the bonus round, I'm going to actually tie in a few things that we talked about, and it's going to hopefully be more of a real world example of what you could do. So let's say sometimes it's a little tedious to have to do 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4. We got to add a plus for every single time we want to add something. Well, maybe that's excuse me, maybe that's a little bit more tedious than what we'd want. So let's write a function. This is where an add function might actually be handy. So we're going to write an add function that just takes as many numbers as you want to give it. So let's, and the way that we do this is it's this keyword thing. And up there earlier, we did a function add that took 3 numbers. And it's like, okay, 2 numbers is normal, but 3, that's maybe a little cool. But this function that we're about to write is going to be unlimited in the number of numbers that you can give it. So we're going to do this special thing called, right here, called args with a little asterisk. And what this is, it's called var args, or variable arguments. And it allows you to pass in as many arguments as you want. And so for right now, I'm just going to write pass because this is going to be a little bit complicated in here. And I'm not going to explain everything in detail when we fill in the pass, but hopefully you can kind of follow along. So if I were to call this function, I could call it with 1 and 2, but I could call it also with 1 and 3 or 1 and 4. So that's going to be what it looks like. And this should print out 3, 6, and, oh boy, 9, 10. So 3, 6, and 10. So, and then if we add a print in front of these, so now I'm going to fill this in, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to return the value of, I'm going to have to add all of these together. So what this is going to look like is a list. So maybe what I should do is actually just print out the list. So you can see here it just prints out what it got. And so this is actually a tuple. So since it has these parentheses, it's a tuple, which means it's an immutable list, essentially. So we got 1 and 2, and since the print function doesn't return anything, so it automatically returns none. So we got 1 and 2, none, 1, 2, 3, none, 1, 2, 3, 4, none. So that's what we're getting in this args parameter. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this built-in function called reduce. And what reduce does is it takes a list and a function. And then what it does is it just calls that function that you provide with every element in the list. And eventually when you're done, reduce gives you back one element. So you get a list and you reduce it to a single element. So what we're going to do is we're going to add all of the numbers in args until we have one element left. And we're going to give it a function, and there's this cool thing in Python where you can define a function in line. So instead of having to come down here and define a function, we would have to call it special add, or maybe stupid add, because I don't want to say special and stupid are synonymous, but this is stupid add because all it can do is 2 things. So first and second, and then we return, and I'm going to fix this in just a second. The formatting it's yelling at me because it doesn't like that. So, but this thing lambda allows me to give it a function in line so that I don't have to do it. So I'm going to do x and y. These are going to be the 2 things that my function gets. It's going to be my first and my second. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to return x plus y. That's it. So I'm going to do that, and then I need to reduce also takes the list, so args, and then it takes something to initialize it with. And so we're going to initialize it with 0. So now, and I'm going to call stupid add in just a second. So now when I print this out, we should get all of that. Oops, why did it? Oh, because we printed here instead of return. So 3, 6, 10. Perfect. So, oops. So that is our special add that takes as many arguments as you want. And so I hope this makes sense. With a lambda, you don't have to specify a return. It automatically returns the value that's right here. So that's what this is. So this, essentially, this whole thing could be replaced with stupid add. And we should get the same thing. So I hope that makes sense. I'm just going to put this back here while I finish talking. But this is obviously a little bit more advanced. We're using this reduce function that accepts another function. So this reduce function is what's called a higher order function. And then this function just goes and goes until we have one value left, and then it returns that thing in add. So up here we were able to use this thing called var args, and then this reduce function, which is higher order function. And what we could do is we could even what's called quargs, and keyword args, and I think you might have to put another thing here, but I'm not sure. Anyway, so we could actually add keyword arguments. So this could be first equals second equals 2. You're gonna have to look that up. I'm not gonna run it because I'm afraid it's gonna break. But anyway, so you can run these things with variable arguments. You can give them keywords. You can give functions to other functions, and if you don't specify a return value, then you will get none back. And then the last thing that we talked about was the global scope versus a local scope. It's really important that you remember that if you ever define anything inside of a function, then it's not going to be accessible outside of that function. So just really important topics. That kind of wraps up what we're going to learn about with functions. But functions are so fundamental to programming. They're the building blocks of everything that we do. It's important that you're really thinking about how to write everything that you do in functions. So because they're so useful.